All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Maybe we'll give this just 1 minute for a few additional people to get signed on, and then we'll get started. We still have quite a few people signing on, so stand by just another minute or so and we'll begin. All right, well, let's get started. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, from wherever you're joining. Thank you so much for joining our Science and Society dialogue focused on science communication. My name is Kristen Tim. I am at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm the track lead for the science communication track within the Science and Society section at the American Geophysical Union. And I'm really happy to be joined today by Stefania Acosta Ramirez, who is a co-track lead in science communication, and Kat Gonzalez, who is a co-chair for the science communication track session at this year's American Geophysical Union fall meeting. We're going to be hosting today's webinar. So just a couple quick logistics. A reminder that this webinar will be recorded. Please mute yourself if you're not talking. There will be a chance. We're hoping to have a pretty good amount of time, like 15 minutes or so for question and answer. So we'll be able to take you off mute if you want to ask your question live. Otherwise, please feel free to put questions or topics for discussion or share information in the chat. One of our goals with these events is to build community, and so we have this great set of presenters and panelists today, but I hope this is a chance for you to all get to meet each other as well. So I wanted to start by just providing a little bit of additional background. So let me share my screen. Okay, there we go. And so just to kind of situate the Science and Society section, for those of you that may not be aware of AGU and their strategic planning initiatives, rather recently, AGU adopted a new strategic plan. And one of the things that's really exciting about this plan is that they have dedicated themselves as an organization to not just discovery science, but also solution science that has a societal impact. And so within the broader AGU organization, there are a variety of sections focused on different science themes and topics. And so the Science and Society section is a relatively newly sort of reformed, renamed section within AGU, and we work to support and grow a community that actively facilitates stronger connections between societies and earth and space science, and foster innovations within AGU that better enable discoveries and solutions in the geosciences to benefit humanity. And so our section has a variety of goals. It serves as a place within AGU for those people whose scholarship includes science and policy, community science, citizen science, science communication, social and behavioral sciences, and art and science. One of our additional goals is building meaningful cross-disciplinary collaborations across sections. We also want to create a welcoming community and space for decision makers and practitioners, those people who work in close partnership with Earth and space scientists. We also want to elevate geoscience in diverse communities, especially those that have been historically underserved by and underrepresented in science. We also want to provide learning opportunities about how the Earth and space sciences can inform policy making, best practices in communicating science, etc. And we also want to be a section that shares information about relevant societal and policy issues with all AGU members. And so within our section, we have 5 tracks: art and science, science policy, community and citizen science, science communication, and social and behavioral science. And if you're interested in learning more about the Science and Society section, I encourage you to check out our webpage or follow on Twitter so that you can hear a little bit more about some of the things that we're working on and how to get more involved. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Stefania to talk a little bit about the science communication track.
Hi, thank you. Yes, then I'm so happy to be here. And who are we? Like, the science communication includes the efforts of natural, physical, and social scientists, communications professionals, communities, and teams that communicate the process and values of science and scientific findings with non-specialist audience outside of formal education settings. Our goals are varied, include listening, sharing knowledge, engage dialogue, understanding, awareness, enthusiasm, improving decision-making, or influencing behaviors. Science communication channels include in-person interaction, online, social media, mass media, or other communication methods. Then we have like a big point to work with, and everyone can participate in science communication. Then I will go to Kat, that it's going to share with us something too, with some announcements.
Yeah, so just a couple of quick announcements for continued involvement with the Science and Society dialogues. Our final dialogue will be Tuesday, November 8th, and this will be on the social and behavioral sciences, hearing from experts in those fields. And then finally, to culminate our semester, we have the fall meeting, of course. The program is now available, so please check it out. We have some really fantastic invited speakers. So please check that out and get involved with both the dialogue and the fall meeting if you are able. So now I'll hand it back over to Kristen.
Yeah, so I'm really pleased that we have 3 great speakers today. We're going to hear from each of them for about 10 minutes, and then we should have a good 15 minutes or so for Q&A after the 3rd speaker. So please make sure to prepare your questions, or you can put them in the chat. And so I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Sarah Yo. And Sarah is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and director of the STEM Ambassador Program at the University of Utah. Her recent research interests focus on humor as a tactic for strategic science communication, and she also co-hosts the Planet SciComm podcast on science communication. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Stefania. Thank you, Katharina. It's really great to be here. It's nice to see everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's hope this works. Thumbs. Great. Thank you. Yeah, hello. It's wonderful to be here. As Kristen said, I am an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah. If you have any questions that come up and you after the session and you want to email me or tweet at me, please feel free to do so. I will say that email is probably at this point in my semester a little bit quicker than Twitter. I try not to spend too much time there, as you know, an hour goes by very quickly, turns out. I'm also the faculty director of the STEM Ambassador program that I'll talk a little bit about today, but it's a program started by professor in biology, Dr. Nalini Nadkarni. Some of you may know her if you've been in this kind of science communication, public engagement spaces, and she started that in 2016. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my journey to science communication, which is a little bit unusual, I would say, not conventional. I have a bachelor's in oceanography from Hawaii Pacific University. I minored in chemistry. I thought I was going to be a chemical oceanographer. I remember when AGU was held in Hawaii, in Honolulu, and it was a big deal, and it was really fun to go to. It's also very overwhelming as a student. So I got my bachelor's degree in oceanography and actually have a master's degree from the University of Hawaii at Manoa in oceanography. And I studied not chemical oceanography, but microbial ecology in my master's program. And then from Hawaii, and I worked on Coconut Island. If anyone has been out to Hawaii, and the University of Hawaii has a research lab on an island off the island of Oahu. And so that was where my lab was. And I decided it was too nice. And so I went to Wisconsin, which I love. Which I should say, I love Wisconsin. Madison is great, right? I was a PhD student in environmental engineering. I was studying similar things, microbial community dynamics in surface waters of freshwater systems. Not many marine systems around Wisconsin. And so while I was there, I did a lot of outreach as a graduate student, and I couldn't really figure out, I couldn't understand. Every time I wanted to talk about microbes and climate, everybody wanted to talk about recycling or something, right? And so I couldn't quite get like, why my microbes are so cool. Why does nobody want to talk to me about this? Eventually, I took a science communication course, my first science communication course with Professor Sharon Dunwoody, who was a great scholar in science journalism. Unfortunately, we lost her earlier this year, which was sad. And I ended up switching to a smaller department called Life Sciences Communication. I got a second master's degree in science communication and eventually got my PhD from Wisconsin in mass communications. In my dissertation, I studied how people select science information from the media. So my work is primarily around media effects, how media affect how we think about science and how we form attitudes about science. And so this kind of journey to science communication has really shaped what I study. As I mentioned, I think about how public opinion about science changes based on, you know, events that are external. I've done some studies on nuclear energy, for example, after Fukushima. I think about how this happens, so the mechanisms by which our opinions and attitudes are formed, thinking about psychological kind of theories like selective exposure, cognitive dissonance, how we might avoid and kind of confirm our own biases unwillingly, right? A lot of this is unconscious, of course. And then information processing. And I started out a lot of this work in the heuristic space, which is just a fancy word for the mental shortcuts that we use to form opinions, right? Like I use my values in some way to form opinions. I very quickly kind of shifted to thinking about how affect, how we feel about something and how emotion might change that, which has led me down this path toward humor research. And there's a reason for that. Part of it is because values are very hard to shift, right? As media and content creators, it's very hard to shift values in an audience, but one can make them laugh. And, you know, maybe thinking about what the effects of making someone laugh might be important to science communication. Okay, enough about me. What I wanted to bring up is that AAA organizations like AAAS, obviously AGU, we're having this webinar right now. The National Academies of Sciences have been very interested in recent years in science communication, even dating pre-pandemic, right? I think the pandemic might have just highlighted how important communicating science is and what we do with scientific information. I apologize if you can hear my cat in the background. She's having a little bit of a fit. It's about lunchtime here in Utah, so sorry about that. Locking her out also just makes it worse. I've tried. And so if you are interested, the National Academies does have a bunch of colloquia on science communication, and a lot of this is available on YouTube for viewing. I was fortunate enough to be involved in 2 of these colloquia, the latter 2. So the last one, Reimagining Science Communication, that happened just this year, and then the one about misinformation that occurred in 2019. And in addition to kind of the videos that are online and on YouTube about these, there are accompanying PNAS articles about science communication. And so I wanted to bring this up. This is from a recent book about strategic science communication. It came out this year. I highly recommend looking into it, by John Besley and Anthony Dudo, who are 2 researchers in science communication. And this is kind of their model for communicating science, right? And the idea here is there's really 3 big things: goals, objectives, and tactics. And you can see them on the kind of first half of this, the strategy and the implementation. And the reason I bring up this is because I think most of my work falls in this implementation. Most of my research falls in this implementation segment, right? I like to think about what are the things that content creators can change, like humor or making someone laugh about science, and how might that affect how they feel about that particular topic. And so in this vein, some of my research has asked, at least my research on humor has asked generally about how humor affects people's attitudes towards scientists and their engagement with science. One of the things I hear a lot about kind of scientists is that they're not very warm, right? They're not very warm and fuzzy. Sorry. I count myself as a scientist. I'm a social scientist, so I'm probably not very warm and fuzzy either. My cat helps me with that. And so, one question is around, can humor kind of humanize scientists for audiences, right? What we know about communication and trust in communication sources is that sources that are more well-liked are more trusted, for example. And I'm not saying that scientists have a trust issue. They certainly don't. Scientists are, in fact, one of the more trusted groups of people in the US, I would say, right? When you compare them with things like politicians, the military is also very highly trusted, but science does kind of hold this sort of privileged position of trust in society in the US. But in any case, the research that I have done recently sort of tries to address this broad question. And I'll just give you an example of the kind of work that I do. I'm primarily an experimentalist, so I like to vary things that content producers might be able to change, right? So for example, the types of humor one might use to communicate about science. Measuring then the psychological state. An example of this might be the amount of mirth they experience. Mirth is just the boring academic term for how funny you think it is, obviously, right? So this experience of humor. And then the outcome variable, some sort of persuasive outcome, such as engagement intentions. Are you likely to share this tweet? Are you likely to comment on it, talk about it with your friends, and so on, right? And of course, the other things that affect how these types of persuasive outcomes are the individual traits that we have. Some of these are values, right? Some of these are traits like need for humor. That's just kind of a funny term for, you might think of it as sense of humor or how much you like to be the source of humor. And so you can see how these individual traits interact with our environment at large, our media environment, to kind of form our engagement intentions. Please tell me to stop talking if I'm going over. I'm so sorry. So as you can see, some of this work has been published. I'm happy to share. What I take away from this slide, actually, after looking at it and putting it together, is that I only publish in 2 outlets: Science Communication and Public Understanding of Science, which is awful. That bottom one is in PNAS and is part of the colloquium, so that should be openly available. But again, I'm happy to share my slides after. And so what my research as a body of work, right, at least the little humor research that I've done recently has found is that it can enhance perceived expertise and likability of scientists, and it really can encourage people to engage with science. And of course, there are caveats to this. The type of humor matters, right? Satire and sarcasm is not as positive. And so, you know, the kinds of biting humor are not as sort of engaging for audiences, right, as others. And we can talk more about that, but I want to make sure to talk about the STEM Ambassador Program and then also give time for my co-panelists. And so this program, as I mentioned, was started by Dr. Nalini Nadkarni at the University of Utah. It's been an NSF-funded program since 2016. And it is a science engagement and communication training program where you really focus on helping scientists build relationships with communities, and specifically non-traditional audiences is what we try to target. Nalini's other projects in public engagement involve bringing science to prisons, for example, and incarcerated populations. And so here we try to leverage a scientist's identity to form connections with audiences that they might already have something in common with, and to kind of inject science into those conversations. And they do come up with an engagement activity, and this forms the focal point of their engagement. But the activity is, and we do spend a lot of time in the activity, but it ends up being the activity is just a focal point for building those relationships. And those relationship building skills are something that we hope scientists can take with them, you know, into other spaces. So just some examples, right? So we've had a STEM ambassador who studies microbiology. She also enjoys cooking. And so she did a workshop at one of the local grocery stores around making kombucha. We've also had others who studied water conservation and interested in social justice, and they went to the Salt Lake County Jail and engaged participants in like discussions about xeriscaping and doing those kinds of work. And so we think about public engagement in the aggregate, right? Any single scientist is not super likely, unless you're Nalini, to have a lot of impact, but engagement in the aggregate, thinking about how many ambassadors one can train and how many people each ambassador can reach, even if it's a smaller reach, but in the aggregate, we might have a much larger reach, especially if we are targeting kind of audiences that are outside of our traditional spaces where we're comfortable, like K through 12, right? Or museums, for example. And with that, I will cede my time to my other panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We get some virtual applause. That was fascinating, and we can't wait for the Q&A at the end of our panel. So I am so pleased to welcome up to the stage Elena Wood, our second panelist. Elena Wood is a sustainability scientist and freelance science communicator who uses social media to discuss climate change and other environmental issues. Her page at The Garbage Queen started on TikTok and now has an audience of over 350,000 people across social media. Elena's research focuses on managing waste in rural areas and addressing climate anxiety and young people. So please welcome Elena. I'll hand the mic over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to try to share my screen. All right, I hope it is working. So, like she said, my name is Elena Wood. I'm a sustainability scientist and freelance science communicator. I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey into becoming a science communicator, why I use TikTok for it, and how you can too. So, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was really bored. So, I, again, kept seeing science and environmental videos. Some were really great. Some were riddled with misinformation. So a few months after I started an account, I just decided to make a video about the environment, addressing some misinformation around climate change, and in particular about waste and sustainability. And that blew up on TikTok. And within about 2-3 months, I amassed 100,000 followers online. Now, again, I never intended on using social media to talk about the environment, to talk about science. But now I do. So as of now, I have over 350,000 followers across all social media platforms. And when I first got started, I was primarily talking about sustainability, not necessarily sustainable living, but the concept of sustainability and how that applies to a lot of environmental issues, including climate change. And when I was discussing climate change, I was primarily discussing climate issues. And last year on TikTok, a lot of young people, so anywhere between the age of like 13 to 30, they were realizing they had climate anxiety, which is a very normal feeling of anxiousness, sadness, anger, and hopelessness about the future because of climate change. And I realized that my videos might be impacting people's mental health, even though I'm what I would consider to be a climate optimist. I still realized I was only talking about climate issues, and that was negatively impacting people. So I made the decision to focus more on climate solutions and climate optimism. And that's really where my social media career and science communication career took off. I started a series called Good Climate News, where every single week I discuss 4 or 5 positive things that have happened in terms of climate science, solutions, and activism. And one other thing I do a lot since the beginning is debunking climate misinformation, and sometimes other science misinformation if there are no other science communicators on the platform to discuss it. So I get a lot of questions about why I decided the name Garbage Queen. Sarah was talking about humor. So humor does work. People always get a kick out of the fact that I'm a scientist and I call myself the Garbage Queen. And I do so because I have a background in waste, and I did have a former supervisor call me the Queen of Trash. So I rolled with it. So why TikTok? I mean, I kind of fell into this. I never really thought I would be a science communicator. And in fact, I didn't consider myself to be a science communicator until a fellow science communicator said, hey, you know, you're a science communicator, right? You're a scientist, you're talking about science. And I was like, oh, little light bulb went off in my head. I'm like, okay, I can take myself seriously. I'm not just a dancing teenager, which I think is what most people consider TikTok to be. Is absolutely not the case. So over half of adults now get at least part of their news from social media, which can be good and can be bad. And TikTok got more hits than Google did last year. Google is great, but also can be an issue, I think, as we all know, when it comes to finding research. And TikTok is even harder to find accurate information on. So that's why we need more science communicators on the app. There are not enough of us. Misinformation runs rampant on the platform. And unfortunately, the only misinformation that gets taken down is related to COVID, which is great that we're getting public health misinformation taken down. And another reason why TikTok is going to be more important for science communication is it's expected to be the largest social media platform ever in the next year. There are over 1 billion active users every single month. And again, it's not just teenagers dancing or goofy cat videos or people sharing recipes. People talk about science, they talk about policy, and they just talk about how those things influence their life. And finally, one reason I prefer TikTok over my other social media channels is that you don't have to have a highly produced video. You don't need to go sit in front of a green screen. You don't need a professional camera setup. You can just use your phone. You don't have to dress up or anything. It's almost like you're having a conversation with people. So how do you get started in this? I'm not saying everyone needs to get on TikTok. I recognize that being on camera is not for everyone, but if you are interested in it, or at least learning more, go get an account, pick your username. It doesn't have to be the Garbage Queen. You can come up with something funny. You can just have your name or what your research is about. And once you have an account, follow and engage with other science communicators, because the way that we communicate science on TikTok is vastly different from what you see on Instagram, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook. I don't know if anyone's doing science communication on Pinterest, but I guarantee it looks a lot different than TikTok. And you can do that by just clicking search, searching our normal like SciComm hashtags, science communicator, and follow these science communicators. Watch their videos, see what they're talking about, and then watch the videos on your For You page, which is that scarily accurate algorithm that the app feeds you. So you just keep scrolling forever and ever. But watch those videos to get an idea of kind of the trends that are going on. They change constantly. And also the tone, because the tone of science communication on TikTok, again, is vastly different than other platforms. It's not so much stern and serious talking to the camera. You don't have to wear your white lab coat. You don't have to be in front of something where you work. It can be funny. It can be sassy. It can be kind of angry. The traditional rules, I think, for science communication have been thrown out the door when it comes to TikTok, because you're fighting for views. And in order to fight for views, you have to do something that's entertaining, but still educational. And if you're interested in producing videos, just start making videos. Play around with different styles. There's no right or wrong way to do science communication, and especially on TikTok. So now I'm going to give just a couple of tips and tricks, because I could talk for hours on how I got started on TikTok, but I think it's important that people, if they're interested, they have concrete ways that they can get involved. So you can also use these types of tips and tricks for other forms of science communication. I find they work very well on Twitter threads, for example. So the number one thing you need to do is have a hook at the beginning, whether it's a question, whether it's an incorrect fact that you're going to later correct, or just a really interesting picture. Or a lot of people will stand in front of a scientific research paper or an article about a research paper, something just to grab their attention in the first 3 to 5 seconds of the video. And then throughout the video, one way to keep people's attention, which is how you get views. It's unfortunate, people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And on TikTok, they're anywhere between 7 and 30 seconds typically. So you've got to keep them engaged the entire time. And the one way to do that is to have text around you in the video to either elaborate a point, so you can keep it short but then elaborate what you mean, or to summarize the point you're saying. And yes, that has to do with attention span, but it can also have to do with accessibility, because some people will either watch without sound on or they cannot hear things. So it's important to have on-screen text, even if you do have closed captionings. It just, again, keeps people engaged and makes your videos more accessible. And one thing I tell anyone who's interested is to not be afraid to use memes. Don't be afraid to do trends. You will probably feel like a fool. You probably will feel embarrassed. And I don't think you're doing it right unless you do feel a little bit of embarrassment. I'm not saying you have to dance. I think I've danced twice, maybe 3 times in the whole history of my account, and I cannot dance, I guarantee it. But don't be afraid to do it, because people will get trends fed onto their algorithm. So if you can find a way to make a trend work for your niche, for your research, whatever topic you want to talk about, do it. I go back and forth between talking to the camera and using some silly trending audio to talk about climate change. Another thing that's different on TikTok than other social media platforms is the use of things like duets and stitches. So duets is where you have someone else's video on one side of the camera and then your video on the other side of the camera. You can talk, you can add text, you can dance, whatever. But using those types of in-app like functions gets it shown out to the algorithm more. So TikTok wants you to use their weird filters. TikTok wants you, like, as you can see here, this weird bee filter. That video got pushed out to a lot of people because I used a trending audio and a very silly filter. Another function that does really well on TikTok, especially if you are trying to further explain an issue or debunk misinformation, for example, is the stitch function, which is where you take the first 5 seconds of a video, not your video, and then you talk for the rest of the time after the video. So it shows the first 5 seconds and then you can explain whatever was going on. I find this works extremely well with debunking misinformation. You take the video that has the misinformation in it, and then you explain why that's not true. Some people may have seen that original video and believed the misinformation. Other people may not have seen the first video, but now they know if they run into it, it's misinformation. Instead of just having a screenshot, people can watch the whole thing and kind of follow along where you've debunked things. And another thing with TikTok, so the videos can go, I think, up to 10 minutes now, but I have personally never seen one over 3 minutes, is that it's going to be extremely difficult to explain your research or whatever you want to say in one video. If you can do it in one video, I think you are a phenomenal science communicator, but I don't think that's possible for most people. So one thing that TikTok really loves is multi-part videos. You can either plan it out to have 3, 4, 5 videos about the same topic, or you can purposely leave your first video very open-ended and get a lot of questions in the comments, and then address those comments in the other videos. The TikTok loves to promote the things where it's multi-part videos. And you can use this function called the playlist function to link them all together. It's kind of like a YouTube playlist function, and it works extremely well. I have a few playlists on my page, one for my Good Climate News series, one for climate action items, and one for like debunking climate misinformation. And one other thing that's been changing extremely recently in TikTok is the use of community-specific hashtags. For a while, you just could write a caption and not have any like hashtags in it, and it would do fine. But now, because TikTok has realized people are using their platform as a search engine, the use of hashtags related to whatever you're talking about is very important. And again, you can use things like hashtag SciComm, hashtag science. Those work, but then on TikTok, they have a completely different way of using hashtags. So they like to add talk, T-O-K, to the end of a hashtag. So there's sci talk, so like science talk. There's edu, like education talk. There's eco, like environmental talk. That's another reason why it's so important, if you're going to get into this, to watch other science communicators to see what hashtags they're using, or go in and search for whatever you want to talk about and see what hashtags and what words and what phrases other people are using. Now I'm curious if anyone is going to get into TikTok, and if you do, feel free to give me a follow, message me. And one thing I really love about TikTok is that, again, there are very few science communicators on the platform right now. So whenever there's a new one on the platform, we love to work with them. And I encourage anyone who's interested in getting into science communication, period, or on TikTok, to reach out to me, and I'm happy to connect you with anyone you really want. So yeah, that's the rest of my time, and I'm gonna give it to the next speaker.
Thanks, Alaya. Thank you so much, because it really helped us to shape like what is happening in the digital world, even with the situation that happened. Thank you for handling that so well. And even that is an invite. We are in a risk because we are in a digital environment communicating environmental science and other kind of science and facts, and we are in risks. We are in risk with things like the one that happened. Then that was very scary, that they can happen in social media as well. Never happened to me soon before. I heard a lot about those situations, never happened to me, but we are always in risk. And that like take us to be like very good at what we do, like communicating science and going with the trends, but being aware what is happening to arrive on time when we need it. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to give the word to Robbie Goldman. Robbie Goldman is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Robbie is a volcanologist whose research includes understanding volcanic behavior, assessing eruption hazards and risk, and communicating volcano science to publics living on or near active volcanoes. Robbie was part of the 2018 AGU Voices for Science Policy Track cohort, and since 2019 has served on the Geological Society of America's Geology and Public Policy Committee. Then, welcome.
Thank you for that introduction, Stefania. I enjoyed seeing the talks given by my two fellow co-panelists. Like Sarah began her talk, I'll start very briefly, just explaining kind of how I got here. So my training is in geology and physics. I went to Pomona College in Claremont, California. I'm actually based in Los Angeles right now, studying remotely, completing my PhD within the next year, simply because I have family here in Los Angeles, made things a little easier during the start of the pandemic. And I also have expanded my collaborations to working with volcano scientists and communicators on the West Coast. So how I got into science communication is related to how I got into the public sphere in terms of science engagement. As Stefania mentioned, I have been involved with science policy outreach through AGU, as well as through the Geologic Society of America. And while I was working on my first thesis chapter, understanding the mechanics of how volcanoes erupt, a major eruption of Kilauea volcano in the island of Hawaii occurred in 2018. And something that really struck me about the communication of information during this event was how social media, for the first time, played a major role in getting information about a volcanic eruption to the public as it was happening. And so just my own interest in how that worked, and the fact that I do have Native Hawaiian heritage. I've got family that live in Honolulu, where Sarah did her undergraduate studies. And so I wanted to get a better sense of how science communication plays a role in hazard response in Hawaii. So the 2018 eruption of Kilauea volcano was the largest that had occurred in over 2 centuries. And there are a variety of hazards produced from this eruption that impacted 3 geographically disparate regions. The lower East Rift Zone, which is shown in pink and red on the map. This experienced lava flows and sulfur dioxide emissions primarily. Over 700 buildings were destroyed through the course of the eruption, displacing a lot of residents. The summit region, located in the yellow on the map, this is a region that was impacted by ash eruptions from the summit of Kilauea, as well as a 2-month-long series of collapse events that produced moderate to large earthquakes on a daily basis. And finally, the southwestern Kau district, shown in gray on the map, which was primarily affected by ash and by volcanic smog, also known as fog. And so in order to communicate these various hazards in real time, or as quickly yet accurately as possible, communicators such as scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey, Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, and their colleagues needed to use a variety of channels or media through which information could be conveyed to the broader public. These included community meetings held in person at various community centers on the island of Hawaii, press briefings between scientists and news media, as well as news broadcast by media organizations, print newspapers, and the news websites and smartphone apps of various news organizations, the official website of the USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, and as I mentioned, social media. For better or for worse, TikTok was not as widely used, at least by the US Geological Survey back in 2018, but Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube were the main modes of communication by USGS and other communicators. And so I mentioned US Geological Survey since I have partnerships, there we go. I've been working in collaboration with scientists at the USGS, and they were the official source of scientific information about the volcano, given that they're the ones who monitor volcanoes on the island of Hawaii for new or continuous activity. They also communicated information as messengers to members of the public. News media also served as messengers, where they conveyed information provided to them by the US Geological Survey or others to the public. One other group of messengers that played a role that I learned about through my research are community messengers, who are residents of the island of Hawaii, who were either eyewitness sources of eruption phenomena that were occurring, or played a role in communicating that information to their fellow community members, friends and family, to make sure that everyone was informed based on the information that they had to provide. And so understanding how these different communicators were perceived by residents was something that I was curious about. And in the first part of my 2-stage research process, I visited the island of Hawaii a few months before the pandemic began, fortunately, to meet with 20 different individuals through the 3 regions of the island that were impacted by eruption hazards to understand what sources of media they used, social media, in-person meetings, radio, television, etc., who they received their information from, which sources of messengers, whether USGS or community messengers, and what their perceptions were about the information and the people communicating it. And what I ended up finding, along with my co-authors, were 4 main themes. One is relevance, or how accessible, clear, or useful information was to people. Expertise, or the perceived knowledge or factual accuracy of that information. Pace, or the regularity and promptness of that information. And sincerity, or the perceived honesty, transparency, or good faith shown by each communicator. And I have a radar chart here in the center comparing those 3 main groups of communicators. HVO is shown, the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory is in blue. This chart shows that among the 20 participants I talked with, they felt the most positively about HVO's perceived sincerity and expertise, felt fairly good about their pace, and a little less so about the relevance of some of the information that was provided to them. Whereas with community messengers, particularly community messengers based where lava flows occurred in the lower East Rift Zone, they tended to have pretty high marks across the board, particularly in terms of relevance, sincerity, and pace. News media, on the other hand, ended up receiving the lowest overall assessment, particularly with regards to sincerity, since most participants felt that the information provided by news sources was often sensationalized and counterproductive. And this gets to concepts that Sarah talked about in her presentation and her research about the importance of being trustworthy. And in fact, in one of my publications that's currently in review, we use this concept of a trusted, credible messenger to describe the importance of having people communicate about a hazard or other event that is not only an expert, but more importantly, as shown by this pie chart by Covello 2010, you need to convey that you're someone who is just likable, can be trusted. And a different Sarah, my colleague Sarah McBride, who has also done some humor research, published a little piece in 2018 about the importance of being likable. If you want people to listen to you as a science, be likable, be warm and fuzzy, as Sarah, the Sarah on this panel had mentioned. And one nice thing about the work the U.S. Geological Survey has done in Hawaii is they've made it a priority in the years leading up to the 2018 eruption to establish those connections. And so that certainly played a role in the perceived sincerity of those communicators by the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. And during a crisis event, that's all the more important because people are already dealing with the trauma of being displaced or the uncertainty of this hazardous disruptive event. The other part of my research, which I'll talk about very briefly, is looking at the social media communications, specifically the Facebook communications that were put out by the U.S. Geological Survey during the eruption. And what I ended up doing was a combination of qualitatively close reading 16 comment threads between U.S. Geological Survey and public followers of their Facebook page to understand the extent to which U.S. Geological Survey scientists answered questions, how they reacted to occurrences of information, the role that public members of the Facebook pages help the U.S. Geological Survey in answering questions and addressing this information, and people's overall sentiments, which relates a little bit to the concept of affect that Sarah had mentioned. And what I found in the end was that similar to my interview participants, there's a positive perception about the U.S. Geological Survey's role in their sincerity in communicating information to people. And through a sentiment analysis I conducted, I found that there's a correlation between the occurrence of users expressing their gratitude and how positively they felt about content on the page as a whole. And so main takeaway from my research is just something that I've iterated and that others have said before. Just meet people where they are, be relatable, and the rest kind of comes from there. And then, of course, be an expert, but also be an expert in how to build connections with people. So with that, I look forward to our discussion.
All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists. Oh my gosh, so many great overlapping themes. So we're going to open up for questions, and just given the fact that we've added some additional securities to the Zoom meeting, I'm going to ask everybody who would like to ask a question to please put your question in the chat, and then we will unmute you to ask your question live. So if you have a question you would like to ask, please put it in the chat, and then we can unmute you to ask that question live.
Robbie, I wanted to say while we're waiting that, yeah, I had lunch with Sarah Kay yesterday, which she reached out on Twitter. She was like, oh my gosh, there's another Sarah Kay. Let's connect. And we do humor research. Let's
Yep.
talk.
How often does that happen?
It was fun.
And while we wait for questions to come in, I have one question I'll just pose to all of you, and hopefully it's a quick answer, but what is one thing that you've learned of great value from your audiences? So when we think about science communication and kind of thinking about it as a two-way model of communication, what's one really important thing that you've learned from your audiences through your science communication work?
I've
Go
got
ahead, Robbie.
So just from the interviews I did with residents in Hawaii, one thing that I made sure to be mindful of was just listening and giving people the time to just have a conversation. And there's actually a culture in Hawaii of talk story, which essentially means taking the time to get to know someone, know their story, know, what they're, where they're from, who their family is, what they do, why they do it, and just kind of building that relationship on, from the ground up, and not really being in a rush to, get to a certain, question or answer. And through that process, I actually learned more about what was important to my interview participants and to Hawaii communities in general, and things that are important for scientists and science communities to keep in mind, more than I would have known without having been a good listener.
I'm going to second that. Being a good listener is probably one of the most important things you can be as a science communicator. I learn so much from my own audience while they're learning from me. So I talk a lot in my work about climate issues. And I think, as we all know, there's so many climate issues happening at the same time all over the world. And it's really difficult to keep up with them as just one person. But my audience helps me figure out what I should talk about. They'll ask me questions all the time, and I get to learn with them in the process, because a lot of the times I am asked questions I don't know the answer to. And I think that's the beauty of science and science communication, is listening and learning with your peers, because science communication isn't just about working with scientists, it's about working with the public as well.
Sarah, do you have anything you want to add on that, or should we go to the next question?
Yeah, I don't really have an audience because I'm not necessarily a practitioner, right? The science communication world is a little bit divided into researchers and then trainers and practitioners. And I will say one thing is that as researchers, we're not super good at hanging out with, Kristen can back me up on this, we're in the same communication sort of circles. But as researchers, we're not super good at hanging out with our practitioners, and kind of, there needs to be more sort of translational science communication research, is my feeling, right? Is that when practitioners are looking for best practices or guidelines, they often have a hard time, because it's behind paywalled, right? It's published in journals that are paywalled, and so you can't get access to it, which is a whole nother issue. But also because a lot of communication scholars, well, there's not a lot of science communication researchers relative to the population of communication researchers and practitioners in science communication. And that a lot of the work tends to not always be in collaboration with practice, and so maybe answers more theoretical questions about communication than necessarily practical ones. And so, the work that Robbie described, for example, and the work that Elena is doing is really important in these spaces.
Yeah, so I think I'll go to Will's question. Will, do you want to ask your question live? We can unmute you.
Sure. I'm kind of jumping in like halfway through all of this, so I don't have a full perspective on all of this. But I'm just kind of curious, like like Elena, I follow most of your work, and that we all live in a specific place, and every place we live has its own set of issues that I think are important to cover through science communication. But at the same time, we also have a broader audience, and I was kind of curious for those that work in climate communication sphere, and science communication more general, how do you balance addressing local issues versus more global issues?
So, hi, Will. Good to see your, I guess, your picture. I struggle with this even to this day because my audience is very global, and I worry that I'm going to lose their attention if I talk about very hyper-local issues. But the more I've gotten into science communication, the more I've realized it is important to talk about local issues, even if, again, like your audience is on a much more global scale. And I think this is just another reason why we need more science communicator practitioners. We need more people who are like public facing, because the more people we have, hopefully the more areas can be addressed. So it's not just me feeling like I have to talk about the entirety of Appalachia, for example, because I live in the Appalachian Mountains. I hope that we will have more science communicators out there who can help make that balance more realistic. Difficult for just one person to talk about local, regional, national, and global issues all at the same time.
All right, it sounds like maybe we'll go on to the next question here from Nora. What is the most counterintuitive finding you have found in your work or research, or the thing that surprised you the most?
Robbie, do you want to take a stab at that? Or I can, it's entirely.
Yeah, sure. I think one finding that was counterintuitive to me between my two different studies is that when I talked to interview participants on the island of Hawaii, most of them got their Facebook information not from the U.S. Geological Survey, but one group of, or several groups of community messengers that they were familiar with. And this was counterintuitive to me only because one of the key sets of data that really made me curious about this work, doing this work to begin with, is the fact that the engagement on USGS Volcano's Facebook page on social media at the start of the eruption ended up being several orders of magnitude greater than the engagement pre-eruption. And so I think I attribute that to the small sample size of 20 people that I interviewed, but it might also speak to the fact that there may have been a comparable or a larger amount of engagement with these community messenger groups as there was with USGS Volcanoes. And I think the larger takeaway from that is there are multiple sources of messengers that can be perceived as credible and followed during these crisis events. And I think just having that awareness and sort of figuring out what that means in your communication response is something that's important for scientists to keep in mind.
And I would add that I don't know about counterintuitive findings necessarily, but I think one thing that surprised me was that there's not a lot of work done on the effects of humor, right? Like there's a lot of theorizing about humor itself and why people laugh, but not what are the effects of that humor. And so that was kind of surprising to me. There is a little bit of literature in the advertising space, as you might guess, right? Does this, funny ad, help people to buy this product and so on. But given that this is something that as people we use so often, I was kind of surprised by how little and how understudied it is. And there's so much work to do, right? There's so much work that also involves things like thinking about in and out groups. How does humor as a form of social control create in versus out groups? Scientists, we may get the joke, right? But somebody else doesn't get the joke. So what are the repercussions of that and so on? So I'll leave it there because as Julie mentioned, we're close to the top of the hour.
Yeah, and just to close us out, Elena, did you have anything you wanted to add on that question?
Oh, they did a great job of explaining it. I haven't really noticed much when it comes to counterintuitiveness yet, but maybe I will soon.
All right, well, thank you all for joining today's session. Thank you so much to our panelists. Just as we wrap up, just a few quick announcements. Remember, our final SY dialogue is coming up on Tuesday, the 8th of November. Also, check out the AGU Fall Meeting program if you want to learn more about science communication. We have a whole track with some excellent presenters, poster and oral presenters. And then make sure to stay in touch with the Science and Society section. Look us up online and follow on Twitter. And we hope to all keep in touch. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions today, but please reach out to our panelists with your questions. And thank you once again to these great panelists. And thanks for sharing your knowledge and experiences with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will just say one thing about Julie's question about time, just really quickly.
Oh,
just
yeah.
that, you know, it is difficult, and it is an ecosystem of people who are involved in science communication and not just a single scientist, because that is not fair to the scientist, right? There are institutional supports that should be in place that maybe are not in place that ought to be. This is a point that I should have made earlier. I'm so sorry. Okay.
Thanks for squeezing that in. It's very important.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great
Bye.
rest of your week.
Thank you.